Welcome to Spirituality 101 here at First Congregational here in Sioux City. This week we continue our journey into some of those basic parts of Christian spirituality by looking at the Bible. And I'm not sure there has been any book that has been as translated, discussed, debated, memorized, and revered as much as the Bible. The Bible is kind of a strange book. It's not an easy book to just pick up and read from cover to cover. It's kind of like this essay. It's a jumble of stories, philosophies, rules, songs, family histories, warnings, praises, with some heroes and a lot of dysfunctional people in it. It's been used to justify violence, and it's been used to inspire nonviolence. It's been used to justify capitalism as well as communism. Out of this book, people have been led to do everything from handling poisonous snakes and speaking in tongues to feeding the hungry and fighting racism. There are nearly as many reactions to the book as there are people who've read it. As far as reading goes, most of us take it for granted that we can read the Bible in our own language. Up until I think it was 1522, when Martin Luther translated the Bible into German, most people could not actually read the Bible in their own language. For the first millennium and a half, the Bible could only be read in Hebrew, Greek, or Latin. And in a big way, Luther democratized the Bible. And that had a huge repercussions for history in the Western world. Today, though, the stir that Luther raised about being able to actually read the Bible in one's own language has died down. And now many Bibles sit dormant in empty drawers in hotel rooms. But what is this book? And since it was written over the course of so many centuries by so many different people, how do you read it, and what, if anything, holds it all together? One way to approach the Bible is to read it as a piece of human literature. Now, for some people, that's almost an insulting way to approach the Bible. But taking the Bible too literally has historically led to problems. And I say that because I know that's personally true. I started reading the Bible when I was about 14 years old. And there was only one way that I could read it as a 14-year-old, and that was literally. And whenever it said, whatever it said, well, of course, that's what it meant. For instance, when Jesus goes and says, tell everybody about him, I took that to mean tell everyone about Jesus. Everyone. Have you ever tried to tell everyone you come across about Jesus? Of course, I didn't do that. It's just not comfortable to bring Jesus up into every conversation. Long story short, I found that the Bible, that taking it literally, became a very guilt-ridden way of living. I could never actually live out what it said to do. And of course, I knew that the fact that even though I was forgiven, I didn't feel it. Because if I really loved Jesus, I would do what he said, and I never did. So I was filled with guilt. But it goes deeper than that as well. The amount of time and energy I spent reading the Bible led to other problems. For one, it became a sort of unspoken competition, which made me a very judgmental person. I saw myself winning this unspoken competition. I saw a lot of Christians who went to church on Sunday, but they didn't seem to do anything more than that. And here I was, reading the Bible every day. Let's just say I can see how people with the best of intentions can turn into those self-righteous Pharisees Jesus warned us about. It would have helped to read the Bible differently in those days. For example, instead of taking that phrase, tell everyone about Jesus, literally, maybe I could have understood that to mean that there are other ways to tell people about God's unconditional love without words. But that can't happen unless I actually knew and experienced God's unconditional love myself. So what I'd say now is to avoid the trap of reading this book in a literal way is to read the Bible like a student of literature. And that means reading it with a sense of the symbolic. It also means looking at the authors as real people who are writing within a specific culture and historical context. When I was young, I remember being bothered by things like this verse in Joshua 10:12 through 15, where it says that the sun stopped in Gibeon. And I thought, if God is really the author of the Bible and the authors are just copying word for word what God said, then it struck me as very odd that God would say the sun stopped. In such an event, if such an event were true, wouldn't God say that the earth stopped spinning so that it appeared that the sun stopped? And even if the writer didn't know at the time that the sun doesn't spin around us, God would have known. So why wasn't it written with some scientific accuracy? But the reason such a thing was written the way it was written is because the author wrote from his understanding of the universe. There are many cases where science may make us take into account the limited understanding of the people of the time. But as a student of literature, that doesn't mean that the truth is sacrificed. It just means that the truth was communicated through very human people who came from a very specific time and place. And in that way, the book is fascinating in how differently the Old and New Testaments are. The Old Testament, written in Hebrew, has almost a campfire storytelling type voice. The New Testament is written in Greek and has a more philosophical tone to it. For some, the Bible represents a shift in the evolution of human thought from narrative to philosophical. And to call the Bible a piece of literature doesn't mean that the book doesn't tell us about the nature of God. I think it should be said at the onset that there is amazing agreement within Christianity that God is revealed to us in two ways: creation and the Bible. In other words, the Bible is not the only way we learn about God. God is revealed to us through creation, and therefore we can learn about the nature of God through nature itself, which includes other people. The Bible is clear on what God is, and it says that God is love. So if we experience love, we are experiencing God, which is perhaps why the motto for the United Church of Christ is that God is still speaking. In other words, God didn't stop revealing him or herself to us at the end of the Bible. God is still speaking, and one of the big challenges in spirituality is to learn, I think, to hear God in the midst of all the modern noise. I think the religious establishment has historically been a little intimidated by this. While many Christians throughout history have agreed that God is revealed through creation and that God is love, they've preferred a more narrow spirituality, something that is written down on paper and is a little more concrete and organized, something that helped them to say, we are for this and we are against that. And Christianity has come up with an unbelievable variety of thises and that's that it's for and against, upon which we've built our various identities. But one thing we all have in common is that we look to the same source for building our identity, and that source is the Bible. So let's look at this book. Where did it come from? How did it evolve and make such, and make, I guess, an attempt to try to put it all into one bite-sized message? I have to say I'm no biblical scholar, so if you want to cut to the short version, just remember the main message of the whole thing is God is love, and yeah, that pretty much sums up the whole message of the Bible. But if you want some more details on this, let's dive in. First off, the word Bible comes from the Greek word biblia, which means books, and that's exactly what the Bible is. It's a collection of 66 ancient books that are written over the course of a millennium or more. There are two main sections in this collection of books. One is called the Old Testament, which is comprised of 39 books. The other is called the New Testament, which contains 27 books. Three major religions of the world, namely Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, look to this collection of books as the source of inspiration. The Old Testament, which could be called the Hebrew Scriptures, contain the sacred texts for people of the Jewish faith, and Christians and Muslims look to the Old and New Testaments for guidance in their faith. The Old Testament was written over the course of, like I said, over a 1,000 years. And in the UCC series that we're following called Confirm, Not Conform, the author writes that many of the stories were passed down over campfires, eyewitness accounts, battle plans, family histories, building instructions, clothing catalogs, expensive accounts, romance novels, rules, poems, and songs. And one thing that they all have in common is they talk about God's relationship with the people of Israel. Now, the first 5 books of the Bible are called the Pentateuch, or the Torah, and it's often said that Moses wrote the first 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The authorship, though, of the Torah is debated. Many Jewish and Christian traditions contend that Moses wrote those books, but modern biblical scholarship has questioned the authorship of those books and if they were really written by Moses. Most modern scholars contend that these books were written a couple hundred years after Moses and were probably written by multiple authors. For many people of faith, this questioning of the authorship of the Torah becomes problematic because some believe that God dictated to Moses word for word everything in those 5 books. And not surprisingly, they are very resistant to anything that challenges this. For them, it was written hundreds of years, if it was written 100 years later by multiple authors, then they think the whole thing is a made-up farce. And that is not an issue that is unique to Judaism or Christianity. Islam has the same issue. Many Muslims believe that the Prophet Muhammad was illiterate. And this is significant because if he couldn't read or write, then the authorship of the Quran rested solely on Allah. Many Muslims believe that the angel Gabriel brought the Quran verbatim to the Prophet, and that the Quran is literally written by Allah. The Quran is so sacred that some Muslims memorize the whole Quran in Arabic. At the same time, within Islam, there is also people who question this and see this from a much less supernatural lens. This issue of authorship, though, gets at the heart of what has caused so much division within religions. Some believe that these scriptures came directly from God, word for word. And that belief often leads to a very literal interpretive approach that results in a fixed and rigid faith. Others approach the scriptures with a view that that's informed by research, and they believe that the scriptures came to us over time and often by multiple authors, and that usually leads to a more flexible approach that leaves some wriggle room for interpretation. Members of the UCC it is said, are not required to believe literally any version of the scriptures. So while there is disagreement on how scripture got to us, most would agree on how to group the different books within the Bible. For instance, it's commonly held that the Old Testament has books about the history of the Jewish people, books full of songs and wisdom, and books about the prophets. The prophets are probably my personal favorite. These are not people who predict the future or anything like that. Rather, they're people who looked around, believed that they could feel like the heart of God and about what they saw, and then they called out whatever they found contrary to that heart of God. The prophetic tradition doesn't end with the Old Testament. In fact, it continues on very well into one of the most famous prophets of all time, Jesus. One significant thing in Christianity is how it bridges these two parts of the Bible. If it draws a hard line between them and says that the Old Testament was for Jews and the New Testament is for Christians, then it really narrows the scope of the scriptures. For instance, these dispensational type people will say that the Old Testament was about the law and that the New Testament is about grace. Actually, it's very clear throughout the whole Bible that the law was always love. And God was a God of, or is a God of mercy and grace, forwarding unearned and unconditional love on creation from the beginning. God's mercy didn't start with the New Testament. And the nature of God is, and always has been, love, and that is the theme that runs throughout the scriptures, all of them. So while the theme of love carries us into the New Testament, there are some differences between the Old and New Testaments. It's worth noting that the New Testament was not written in the same order as it is presented to us today. Paul's letters were written before the Gospels about Jesus, but when we page through them today, the Gospels will appear first. But they're really four different accounts. The Gospels are actually four different accounts of the same person, Jesus. The next book after the Gospels is called the Acts of the Apostles, or just Acts, and it describes the early years of the church right after Jesus. There are a lot of wild stories in there. Shipwrecks, angry mobs, people getting arrested, important debates, and crazy stuff. After Acts, the rest of the New Testament is comprised of letters to churches written by a guy named Paul of Tarsus. Paul is a key figure in the New Testament. Paul was a Jewish leader who persecuted Christians, and then he had a dramatic conversion and ended up becoming one of the biggest voices for Christianity. He becomes, through his journey, absolutely convinced that God's love is all-inclusive, and not that God's love was ever exclusive, but Paul is the one of those people who challenges the pervading narrow scope of God's love and broadens it out into explicitly to let people know that God loves everyone, regardless of race, religion, gender, social status, everyone. The Bible's concluded with a very different kind of book called Revelations. It was written by a guy named John who was exiled on the island of Patmos. It includes just wild visions of the future. So the Bible is really an anthology of a bunch of books. It's a messy read, kind of like this one. It's a jumble of so many things. And some of the people are good and some are really bad. And it doesn't present a rosy picture of reality. But through it all, and even though there are a lot of people who mess up in this book, we find a God who is not giving up on us and is full of love and mercy and forgiveness. And we find a God who loves this creation and is very much concerned about what goes on in this world. Well, thanks for joining us this week. I hope that describes a little bit about the Bible. I think it's an interesting book, and hope this helped a little bit in this journey. I'll be back next week. Hope you can join us. Thanks. Peace.